Welcome to the big piano comparison video. That's piano plugins or piano libraries, VST pianos, virtual instruments. I tested and compared all the pianos I was able to get my hands on, but I'm not just going to compare all the pianos I was able to find, I'm going to compare the pianos that have the same goal, and the goal I like to see most in piano plugins, and that is to replace a piano as closely as possible. And I think piano plugins in that regard are a very interesting type of virtual instrument, because you see this right here, playing this can be so close to playing a real piano because they have exactly the same user interface. Like, ignore this part right here. This is the user interface of a piano, and you can replicate this so well for a MIDI controller. That's why all MIDI controllers look like a piano, more or less. And this one even has wooden keys. They're a bit clicky. That's bad. It's getting a bit old. I need a new one. Studio Logic, Yamaha, Kawaii. Anyways, because the user interface of an instrument like this and a real acoustic piano, upright or grand, is so similar. In theory, you can make this behave exactly the same way as an acoustic piano. But many pianos don't even try to do that. And those plugins, we won't look at those at all today. Also, no prepared pianos, no upright libraries. It's all grand and all trying to replace an actual piano playing experience. I'm aware that this is a pretty long video, but it's also packed, I tell you. I tried to make it as short as possible, and I structured it in a way that made sense to me. But feel free to use the chapter markers and jump around to find the info you're looking for, but I do think you're going to get the most out of it by watching it most of the way through. Here are all the chapters. I decided to group the pianos into different comparison groups, because I think it's pretty pointless to compare 26 pianos at the same time with like audio examples. That's way too many. So I tried to talk a lot about my thought process, and especially in the first comparison group, we're pretty slow getting through these pianos because I wanted to talk a lot more in depth about my system and my thought process and my priorities. But as the video goes on, the pace is going to pick up. To see how close a given piano plugin comes to replicating the real deal, I developed 5 tests that you can do yourself in the piano plugin you're working with to see how close it gets. Alright, so test number 1 could be if you can press the keys so softly that there's no sound at all. The piano behaves like that because these hammers, you need to propel them with a bit of momentum so they actually hit the strings. And if you press the key too slowly, it won't build up the necessary momentum to hit the strings. This feature I'll call silent key. The results of these tests I try to capture and display in a chart that looks like this. Test number 2. Second test you can do is you can press the pedal and see if that results in any noise. Because on a real piano, if you press the pedal, these felts right here, they will be lifted from the strings, which causes them to vibrate a bit. So all the strings are going to vibrate a bit if you press the pedal. This is what I refer to as pedal noise. Test number 3. For the third test, you can press the pedal down and then press the key. This will also cause the strings to vibrate even more because of the force of the key you pressed. So you get a lot of resonance from this. And then if you let go of the pedal, most of this resonance should be gone. The sound of the key without pressing the pedal and the sound of the key with pressing the pedal is different. This feature I'll call string resonance. Press the pedal, hit the key, let go of the pedal, see if that changes the sound. Test number 4. Can the piano do sympathetic resonance? For that you need a lower note that has a lot of the same harmonics as a higher note you're going to press. For example, an octave. So we're going to press this key silently and then the one an octave lower, loudly and shortly. This will cause this string to vibrate. That's sympathetic resonance. And the last test, test number 5, how does the pedal interact with the release stage of a note? If you let go of a note on a real piano, you can catch that note by engaging the pedal before the decay stage has ended completely. That's usually called repedaling. You can press the pedal and catch that vibrating string and keep it going. So you can hit the pedal after you let go of the keys and you will still have notes that carry on going. Also, the pedal doesn't just switch between sustaining and not sustaining. you can actually get a gradient in between and make the notes just sustain for a bit before they fade out. Half pedaling means that there's not a strict threshold between this sound and this sound, but you can control the decay with more nuance, like this. Combined, I like to call these features real pedaling. And some virtual piano libraries actually pass some of these tests. And in theory, of course, you can implement all of these into a virtual instrument. And a digital piano, like my stage piano, my Kawaii, actually passes all of these tests. So it's definitely possible. I've been dreading to start shooting this video because I think it's going to be a long one. But let's get into it. I want to try to get through the spreadsheet from top to bottom. We're going to start with Monastery Grand by Melda Production. 2 stars is my pretty much arbitrary emotional rating. Just my gut feeling. This is like a 2-star plugin. Price is a very important factor. Something free that is pretty good is going to have more stars than something paid for that is pretty good. It's around 3.6 gigabytes big, and that's also a very important thing to look at. Usually you're going to find better sounding pianos are going to be bigger, especially if they're sample based. But if something is pretty good, but is also pretty small, that might be valuable to some people. On the other hand, if something is very big, but only sounds kind of okay, mediocre, it might not be worth your time. Not sure what piano model they exactly sampled here, but they did so with 3 microphone positions. We have microphone position A, microphone B, and microphone C. Let's contrast this with the Meldway Grand, which is very different, but by the same company. This one is $100, but you can also get it just if you buy Sound Factory LE, and it's a lot bigger. It's 40 gigabytes. This one definitely sounds a lot more pristine than the Monastery Grand. It also has significantly more mic positions, 7 to be precise, and that kind of puts the 40 gigabyte into perspective, right? The more microphone positions a piano plugin offers, the bigger it's going to have to be, if it's sample based at least. We have a binaural head. Close border. This is one I really like, I have to say. That's why I gave it 3 stars. Maybe also notable, you can have all 7 microphone positions active at the same time, which isn't always the case. Sometimes you have a big selection, but you can only have 2 or 3 active at the same time. This also feels a lot more dynamic to play with than Monastery Grand. With Monastery Grand, I was able to check under the hood and see how many velocity layers were used exactly. It should be 5. And I tried to do the same with Meldway Grand, went into the edit screen, and I tried to figure out how many velocity layers it has, but I didn't really figure it out. So I tried to hear how many it has, and I think that's honestly nearly impossible in most cases. My guess is it has at least 4, but also if we compare it to the 5 layers of Monastery Grand, it has to has more, or at least they use them in a way smarter way, and it's also way bigger. So probably 4 is way too low. Whenever there's a question mark behind a value like velocity layers, I didn't actually figure out the exact values, and that's quite common. Not too many developers use the velocity layer count as marketing material, which I find a bit sad. I would like to have more transparency in that regard. This is also one of many Steinway Model Ds we're going to encounter. Talking about Steinway Ds, let's now look at the UVI Model D. It sounds usable, but I think it's not comparable with something like the Meldway Grand. It's also significantly cheaper and significantly smaller. Just 1 GB, fixed microphone positions, like you can't adjust anything about the miking. Not sure how many velocity layers this one has either. But I doubt it's too many. Could be as low as 2, honestly. By the way, with these 3 things, velocity curve, high-low keys balance, volume-velocity correlation, the question is, are these things adjustable? Another very important consideration to make when sampling an actual piano in multiple velocities and then mapping those to MIDI values, and those MIDI values then getting triggered by another piano with a different keyboard, is the question, where exactly do you map which velocity of a piano note? There's no standardization or anything like that. That's why I think it's really important that a good piano library comes with some sort of adjustment for the velocity curve. Many MIDI controllers like this one will have a feature like that as well. On here I can, for example, choose between different touch settings. And I think that's pretty important. But I think it's also pretty important that you can do this from within the plugin, so you can combine the 2 settings and balance the 2 out and get the exact right play feel. And with the UVI Model D, you can adjust your velocity curve like this. This changes how the MIDI sent by my controller interacts with the sample libraries. If I turn it down, I can play pretty hard and it's still going to sound pretty soft. And if I turn it up, I'm going to reach the harder velocities quite fast. Compared to the volume velocity correlation, which in this plugin can be found right here, if this is turned all the way up, this means playing quietly will result in quiet notes. Playing loud will result in loud notes. But if you turn it down, the volume of the different velocities will even out. So the softest notes are the same volume as the hardest notes. It even can kind of create an inverse effect where the quiet notes sound louder than the hardest notes, the brightest notes. With many velocity layers, the velocity curve determines which sample will be picked depending on how hard you play. And the volume velocity correlation determines how loud each of these velocity layers is played back. Alright, let's move on from the Model D, not really one of my favorites. Let's now look at Addictive Keys by Excellent Audio. This is another Steinway Model D. From my personal experience, this might not be the most realistic or the most natural feeling piano, but I think it's one of the best compromises in production ability combined with how it feels to play. I really like the timbre. It's also a decent price at $90, and you can even get a free perpetual trial demo, which just has a limited key range of around this much. You can't use the top and bottom for free though. It's also surprisingly small at 700 megabytes, and because of the way you can adjust the volume velocity correlation and kind of adjust the velocity curve, here it's actually pretty easy to figure out how many velocity layers the plugin has. See, this slider right here is kind of the way you can adjust the velocity curve, which isn't as flexible because you just determine the range and you don't really determine the curve. That's why this one has just a dash instead of a tick in that area. And it lets you say something like, oh, I only want this exact velocity. Now, no matter how hard I play, it's always going to be the same exact samples used. But in combination with the volume velocity correlation, which you can do in this volume tab, velocity volume, everything's exactly the same. And if you just scan through this bar, you can kind of figure out at what velocity a new sample is triggered. And you can see right here, it might have 6 different mic positions available, but it only lets you mix between 3 of those. Now the high-low key balance, what I mean by that is, can you differentiate between how higher mid-rangey keys are triggered and how lower keys are triggered? And that's a pretty important feature if you want to simulate an exact piano, because piano keybeds usually have a feature that's called waterfall. So higher notes oftentimes are a bit softer, lower notes are a bit stiffer to play. Depending on with what MIDI controller you're coming into the sample library, it's also going to feel less or more natural. So just having a slider like that. Now the lower notes are very dominant. If you turn it in the other direction, the higher notes are way more dominant. So this is not only a handy feature for mixing, but it also lets you find a sweet spot for the way you like to perform. It's kind of a necessary tool to have when trying to be compatible with as many MIDI controllers as possible, because some keyboards might send varied velocity values depending on the range you play, because the lower keys might be stiffer than the higher ones. Let's stick with this plugin for a second and look at the next point in the table called release. Usually, to have a realistic sounding piano, you will have to sample the release. And if you check out the editor in here, you see that there's even a checkbox saying release samples. If we uncheck that, the release sounds terrible. But that's how many pianos, especially cheaper or free ones, approach the piano release. Basically, the piano sample just cuts off like this, and then you can add a bit of release, right? And if you don't play something percussive, it can be enough, it can work. But as soon as you go into something percussive like this, it will be very hard to sound convincing. It's not bad, right? It's okay. But let's compare it again to if we have release samples enabled. That's the realism we're looking for. All right, let's check out a freebie by IK Multimedia, Berlin Grand. This is one that came out pretty much near the top end of my last bigger piano comparison video, which was only focused on free pianos. You can watch it right here. It's interesting though that this is a comparable size to the Addictive keys, but it has fixed mic positions. And I would also say it's less fun to play. Like, I only gave it 2 stars out of 3. This barely passes the release test. I think it's good enough. It could be better. You also see this has very many red X's. This is not a very adjustable or even a very realism-focused piano, but among free ones, it's still okay. There are better free ones out there. One feature in this one I find kind of interesting is the Resynthesis. Sometimes I mark an additional feature with an exclamation point. That means I think it's a very handy and very cool feature, but I don't think it's focused on making the library more realistic. It's just a cool sound design tool. And here we have the Resynthesis. Let's check it out. At the beginning it sounds normal, but then you can start playing around with this formant and harmonics knob. I mean, that's a pretty unique sound and pretty large amount of flexibility, especially for a free plugin. Alright, let's do a quick recap of the 5 pianos we looked at so far. I would expect many of you watching were waiting for an exact comparison like I just did. But personally I wouldn't give too much weight to that. Like, I didn't think the Meldway Grand sounded particularly great. I'm not sure if it maybe has something to do with the way I recorded my DAW. And also it's just a tiny look into the full capability of all those instruments. As I try to cover, they're all very adjustable and you can get quite a variety out of most of them. So my favorite ones of these 5 are definitely Meldway Grand as well as Addictive keys. They're the most fun to play and you have the most control over the sound, and they also have pretty much all of the features you could ask for. Not quite all of them. I know we're quite slow getting through these pianos, but I'm hoping that as the video goes on, I can ramp up the speed significantly, because I'm hoping I can let the table I made speak more and more for itself. Also, I'm going to decide on like a top 5 of my favorite pianos and do a comparison like I just did with those top 5. And now we're going to quickly look over some pianos that I don't love as much as others and that probably won't make it into the top 5 as efficiently as I can. When I first got into music production, around 4 years ago maybe, Keyzone Classic was in talks for being a good or even one of the best free piano plugins. But in the context of this video where we're actually looking for realism, this chart that I made, whatever, I wouldn't put this too high on our list. It's a couple of different piano models, not very deeply sampled, only 700 megabytes total. You can hear right here, pretty bad release. But depending on the genre and the role of the piano in the mix, even this can yield good results. Air Music's Mini Grand actually keeps surprising me. Don't get confused about this control right here. I would say this only has one set of samples, but what you can do with this wheel is kind of adjust the velocity curve, right? Which is going to make the play feel and the piano sound very different. But I think it's all the same sample sets. Does this actually have string resonance though? In my testing I seem to have marked that it has. No pedal. Pedal. I think there's definitely a difference. So surprisingly good. Definitely not worth the $100 full price, but it often comes with hardware bundles and is often on a steep discount. Next up, Muze's Mirage. Spoiler alert, don't buy this one. I would even go as far as to say don't buy anything from Muze. I bought this for about $20, which was the light version, and there's a full version for around $100, but I think the download I got is the same one as you get with the full version. The difference is this one has 4 mic positions, while the other one has 10 mic positions, but I also have an instrument with 10 mic positions. But that one seems to be buggy, I don't know, and I think I also encounter bugs with this piano. You can hear right away, it has a weird release sound. Some samples don't seem to load properly. And then suddenly it seems to work again. And it seems to have a very low polyphony. You hear that? Some notes are cutting off because I'm playing other ones. That's low polyphony. And yes, this only works in full Kontakt. And I could go and edit everything myself. But I paid for a product I would have imagined to be functioning properly, right? Like here I can turn up the polyphony. And there are 12 velocity layers, but I can't hear 12 velocity layers, honestly. That sounds like 1.5. And with 12 velocity layers, I'm really missing any form of velocity curve adjustment. And even out of this, you can get nice sounds, of course. But don't buy it. After I encountered these bugs, I asked for a refund, which they said on the website would be possible in certain cases. Didn't hear anything back. I also left a negative review on their website. Never appeared. So stay away. Next up, labs. Many people also talk about labs when talking about best free piano plugins. But in the context of this video, where we're looking for the features on this table, where we want realism, we want to replace actual piano playing experience, you can't talk about labs. The best piano I was able to find in labs is the Glass Grand. Which is also a very unsatisfying playing experience because it feels like the velocity layers are just doing whatever they want and I don't really have control over them. And there's also this slider, which seems to do something with velocity or volume, but you have to use this slider and you can't actually control the velocity and volume just with the keyboard. But there seems to happen something when I press the pedal, which is interesting. A comparable product I prefer slightly over that is the SINE Factory piano called Rotary by Orchestral Tools. But the release is significantly worse, and depending on what you want to play, it's not really usable. Alright, now a brief look at the new 1928 piano by 8dio. Which is a very weird candidate at 10.7 gigabytes, but it only has like 3 velocity layers, and the rest is creative layers, right? Something like that. Some of these I mainly want to mention briefly so that people know that I thought about them, because otherwise I think people are going to say stuff like, hey, why didn't you talk about the vintage 1928 piano by 8dio? That's one of the best free piano plugins that exists. No, it isn't. Slightly better, I think. From what I understand, they used the same sample set to make this 1928 Steinway in Soundpaint. And this one is slightly more interesting to me. Velocity layers, I wrote many but few because it doesn't have many velocity layers they sampled. It's quite limited. The same ones actually as with the other vintage Steinway we just looked at. That was for full Kontakt. But here in the Soundpaint sampler, they have a technology where every sample is kind of made unique. And there's supposed to be this gradual transition from velocity layer to velocity layer through them generating samples in between. And every MIDI velocity value is supposed to sound kind of unique. So this is supposed to give you a bit more of a natural play feel, but because the lowest and highest velocity layers they sampled are too close together, I think, and also because those aren't mapped in the smartest way, you still end up kind of feeling restricted, and I still feel I can't really be expressive. So all this cool technology basically for nothing, with this instrument at least. Maybe I should check out the paid Soundpaint pianos. None of these 6 pianos are going to make it to the final 5. For the final 5, I want to pick 3 paid plugins and 2 free plugins. And my suggestions for best free plugins are yet to come. Stay tuned. Also maybe subscribe. Alright, let's do a comparison between some Kontakt pianos. chose 3 paid and kind of pricey Native Instruments pianos, and also threw in 3 free third-party ones. I think from Complete 14 Standard, you could expect Noir Pure to be the best piano library. And I think it's pretty good. It's definitely a lot more feature-packed than the Grandeur, which is quite a bit older. I think both sound good. With the velocity settings I had, the Noir Pure sounded better, but I think the Grandeur, you could get a bit more out of it still. Hammersmith Free is one of the best free pianos, I think. Maybe a contender for the top 5, as well as Noir for the paid ones. This one was significantly less responsive to my playing though. Maybe I think you could get some more out of it, but I think the other 2 ones are more responsive, are more dynamic. Piano in 162, I added this to the list because this is another one I read people talking about being one of the best free pianos. You need full Kontakt to run it, but you can also get it for Soundo. My biggest annoyance with it is that the samples don't start at the same time. So some notes will start later than other notes. Maybe it's on purpose, but it feels like the person developing this didn't cut off the beginnings of the samples consistently. Alicia's Keys, honestly, is going to be one of my favorite ones. It has a specific sound. It's a different piano model. By the way, I've always noted the piano model and the piano length. And the Creative Toolbox, it's not terrible. I also sometimes encounter some bugs with it, I think. If we solo the Decca mic right, the loudest notes don't seem to have any samples mapped to it. Obviously, the decay of that one is pretty bad. For certain applications, pretty much unusable. I think through it having 3 mic positions and also otherwise sounding okay, maybe there's still some value in it for some people. Hey, we're getting towards the end of the video. There's 2 more additional features I marked with an exclamation point that I want to take a closer look at. The first one being key shift. And I have the Boss Digital New York L 1991, which does offer this feature. For a closer look at this piano and all the other Boss Digital Labs pianos, check out this video I made. So this piano actually covers most of the features I'm looking for. And also it has the cool feature called key shift. Basically lets you shift which samples you're triggering with a key. Right now I'm triggering the default C, but if I shift this down, I'm actually triggering what used to be the C sharp sample, but pitched down half a step. So this gives your piano kind of a tuned down feel. You can also do the opposite. Which will give your piano more of a pitched up feel. I think it's a great sound design tool. And quite a number of pianos have this feature, as you might spot when looking at these charts. I'm going to show all of the charts again at the end of the video. I really don't know if this is a candidate for top 5, but I think it's good enough that I want to hear it against the top 5, so this should also go into a bigger final comparison. Let's move on to the last feature that I marked with exclamation point that I wanted to mention, that being Player. And the only piano that I know of that does something like that at the moment is UJAM's Virtual Pianist. I think on the realism side, it can't really keep up with some of the deeper sampled instruments in this list. Still, it has a nice sound, but the key feature that makes this one worth a mention is this player right here. If that's what you're looking for, I think you know. I got 2 more sample-based pianos to go, and then we're going to look at some modeled pianos. One of my favorite pianos actually, Pianissimo by Mixcraft. There is a feature they call sympathetic resonance. I think that's just what I called string resonance in my chart. Let's move on. This might be one of the top free piano plugins out there. Numa Player. It comes with 2 grand pianos, the Model D and the Model F. And the Model D might sound a bit better, honestly. But just for variety's sake, I mainly want to focus on the Model F, because there's so many Model Ds already in this video. And I think especially for a free piano, it's pretty crazy how many green check marks they get in the list. It's also pretty nice to play. Check out this half pedaling. So this could be one of our top 3 pianos. And now let's get into the modeled pianos. SampleTank is a developer I really enjoy. I really like all of their electric pianos I tried so far, and I'm a bit sad to say that I'm not a huge fan of Meta Piano, especially considering they were nice enough to send it to me for free. Let's listen to it. This was developed with a technology that SampleTank calls spectral modeling, as opposed to physical modeling. And I think there are certain areas on the piano that it sounds pretty good, like this lower register. But in this mid-range right here, I think it's the weakest. Maybe if we adjust the keyboard to trigger some lower velocity values, which you sadly can't do in this plugin, right? Dynamics only adjusts velocity volume correlation. I think that's maybe slightly more pleasant. What I feel sometimes is it sounds like various pianos mashed together, and it doesn't sound like one consistent instrument. It's an interesting instrument to play, in some ways maybe more expressive than a sampled instrument, but it doesn't sound like a real piano. Also, something I like to do is layer this with sampled pianos, like we could layer this with the Numa piano. It's a really fun instrument to play if you combine the more grounded, realistic sound of a sampled instrument with the more expressive, experimental technology of a modeled piano like this. A little bit of a digression here. If you take this further, I think it's interesting what kind of sounds you can get. Let's layer this also with Pianissimo, L, Vogue. Has kind of a CP electric grand quality to it. Back to our candidates for best realistic piano. Let me just briefly mention Neo Piano, Piano 1 by Sound Magic. When I first encountered this free piano plugin, I was amazed by the nice, rich sound. From what I understand, this is hybrid, so there are some samples involved, but there's also some modeling involved. And first impression was very high, but the more I used it, the more I realized something painfully, in hindsight, painfully obvious. The release of this piano sounds so bad. So if you do something mildly percussive, it feels so unusable, and I really don't like this piano anymore. And I see it mentioned for best free piano still quite frequently, and I can't get behind it. Before I mention my pick for potentially the best free piano plugin out there, let's look at one of the potentially best paid piano plugins out there. It's a big name, and you probably expected it on this list. Pianoteq. Obviously, this comes with quite many different piano models, and all of them are going to sound a bit different, but all of them are using the same technology. Currently, I've loaded the Petrov 275. Because this is physical modeling and a very deep plugin, basically you can do anything with this. Let's talk about mic positions. When sampling, you actually have to record different mic positions. And here the microphones are all software. They're all modeled. So if we go to this view, we can actually place our mics exactly, right? So if you want to see it like that, you have infinite different mic positions. Same with velocity layers. Basically, you can generate a unique sound for every velocity layer. This makes this plugin extremely expressive, and it's very nice to play with, and it's also very flexible in terms of sound design. Let's check this out. You can make it older. It's maybe a bit too old for today. Because this is all synthesized, you can also automate all these sliders. So while you could also find a sound like this that is sampled, can you do something like this? Or something like this. I think that's something really cool about Pianoteq. I think especially in the mid-range, I would never think that this is a synthesized sound. To me, it sounds equivalent, exchangeable to a sampled sound. In the higher extremes, sometimes I don't love how it sounds. It also depends on the exact model I'm using. But the weakest parts I find in Pianoteq are the bass notes. Like this one, for example. This to me sounds so far away from what a sampled piano would sound like that it's difficult for me to get past it. The question here though is also, does it sound weird because I'm not used to this sound because sampled pianos sound different? Or does it sound weird because real pianos sound different? It might also be that this can actually create a real piano vibe in a way that samples never were able to, and that's why I'm just not used to it. I think there's a truth to both of these options. Personally, I think while meta piano is definitely in a completely different league and in many ways is not comparable to Pianoteq with these bass notes. While I do prefer how Pianoteq sounds even there, I think there's some quality that's kind of realistic to these bass notes that Pianoteq misses. Let's see again. Like the New York L, the bass notes there. This note. I think none of these sound particularly great. Also, oftentimes real pianos don't sound particularly great in these ranges anyways, right? But to me, the samples sound the most realistic, the most natural. And now, the final piano of the video, before we do another one-to-one comparison of some of my favorites. This might very well be the best free piano plugin and nobody's talking about it. It comes with Analog Lab Play and it's just the American Home Grand. This is another physical modeled piano and I think this one is nearly comparable to Pianoteq and it's completely free. It doesn't have many sound design features, but it has many realism features. Feels a bit dull. Let's maybe give it some timbre. That's exactly like the H knob in Pianoteq. Pretty cool. Let's make it a bit more dynamic and a bit brighter. It has actually similar issues in the bass regions as Pianoteq. Sounds a bit too plasticky, too bouncy, but in the mid-range, top range, I think it sounds very good. Sympathetic resonance. Half pedaling. And it's free. I think that's incredible. Alright, let's do a final comparison of some of my top picks. So I ended up with a bit more than 5 pianos for the final comparison. I decided to add the Mini Grand as kind of a reference point. I'm not sure if I would consider it in the top end, but I think it's interesting how close it gets considering how widely spread this plugin is. Honestly, talking about the different Native Instruments pianos, all 3 that I mentioned in this video could have made the list. Noir definitely has the best and most modern plugin, but Alicia's keys and the grandeur also sound comparably good. For this final round, I tried to make all the plugins sound as good as I could and make the play experience as good as I could. And I have to say that with Noir, I didn't quite get to the same level of happiness as with the other ones. I did feel that the velocity curve in the plugin wasn't quite compatible with the velocity curve on my keyboard. It wasn't the best play experience, but it does sound very good and it does sound very expressive, even if it's not as nice to dial in the expressiveness when playing. Meldway Grand is still one of my favorites. I used a different software to capture my DAW for this last demo, and I do think it sounds better here. Freebies, I think we have a pretty clear top 3, the Numa Player, Analog Labs Piano, and Hammersmith Free. For this last demo, I dialed back the reverb in Hammersmith, and I noticed that the release of it doesn't sound quite as good as I first thought. So I think Numa and Analog Lab beat Hammersmith Free for me. I think Pianissimo and Addictive keys don't sound quite as good as the rest of them, even the free ones, but I still really like both of those plugins. They're affordable and very fun to play with. With Pianissimo, if you're considering buying it, you have to figure out how to get the 64-bit version. That's a bit of a hassle, because it doesn't come with the standard download, I think, but you can get it in some way. I managed to do it, I don't remember exactly how. But that's something Mixcraft should definitely address. Pianoteq managed to do the best on paper, definitely. Everything except one green tick, and I do think the high-low keys balance that Pianoteq missed is probably one of the most optional features, because you can't really sample that. It's kind of a workaround. But still, I think it's a bit sad that none of the pianos actually managed to get all green ticks, so it's always going to be a bit of a compromise. But I hope this video helped you with the charts and with the examples, figuring out where the piano libraries you already have might be lacking a bit and what more you could expect from different piano libraries. Also, of course, I wasn't able to test every piano in existence, so feel free to leave some more suggestions for pianos in the comments that I might be able to tackle in another video like this. What do you think of the system? You think there was anything missing? Thank you very much to Modart for providing me with Pianoteq, to UJAM for providing me with the Virtual Pianist, to Boss Digital Labs for providing me with their piano collection, as well as SampleTank for providing me with their Meta Piano. I really hope you enjoyed this video and you got some use out of it. If you did so, please consider subscribing and leave a like, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!